I knew I didn't belong from the very first moment I stepped into Oliver's childhood home. No one had to say it aloud. The silence spoke louder than words. The way they looked at me, like I was a stain on their perfect picture, made my chest tighten with something I couldn't name back then. But now I know it was rejection, pure and quiet. For 6 years, I lived among people who never truly saw me as part of them. I smiled through holidays, brought wine to family dinners, laughed at jokes I didn't understand, and I tried to fit in. But their world had walls, and I was always on the other side. Helen, my mother-in-law, made it clear from the start. She had this way of greeting me that felt like a test. Her handshake was firm, her smile was hollow. It wasn't warmth, it was a calculation. Her two daughters, Candace and Julia, followed her lead like shadows. They didn't raise their voices or throw insults. No, their cruelty was colder than that. They excluded me quietly, completely. I remember making Helen's favorite pumpkin pie one Thanksgiving, following her recipe down to the exact spice ratios. I placed it on the table with hopeful hands and waited for a smile. She didn't even taste it. Said she was saving room for dessert while laughing over wine with her daughters about their ski trip to Vermont one I wasn't even told about. And Oliver? He'd shrug when I brought it up. You're reading into things, Everly. They just need time. Time. That word became a rope I clung to for years. Time would fix it. Time would soften them. Time would make them see me. But time didn't bring me closer. It just made the distance feel permanent. The family group chat never included me. Oliver was the only one who invited me to weekend brunches or family outings. And even then, I felt like an extra chair someone forgot to put away. I became proficient at smiling with my mouth while holding back the ache in my chest. One evening, as we drove home from another stiff dinner, I asked Oliver quietly, "Why don't they like me?" He looked at the road, not at me. "My mom's just particular. She's old-fashioned." That night, I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the blank wall, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. It wasn't their words that caused me to feel small, but rather their silence, because I was slowly disappearing in a house full of people who treated me like a stranger, and a husband who stood in a corner, pretending not to see. I used to tell myself they just needed more time. Perhaps one day, Helen would inquire about my week's events. I hope that Candace will choose to sit next to me during dinner, rather than facing away from me. I hope that Julia would laugh at one of my jokes, not out of sympathy, but because she truly found me humorous. But that day never came. Instead, the silence grew louder. The smiles are tighter. The gap is wider. By the 4th year of our marriage, I gave up trying to fit in. I stopped bringing desserts to gatherings or suggesting family trips. The more effort I gave, the more invisible I became. I still remember the moment it all shifted, the moment I realized I was truly alone in this family. It was a week before Christmas. I had gotten off work early and drove by Helen's house, thinking maybe I could drop off some pastries I'd picked up. It was snowing lightly, and the streets were quiet. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw Candace and Julia's cars already there. My heart fluttered with hope. Perhaps they were preparing a pleasant, festive event. Maybe I'd walk in and see them wrapping presents or baking cookies like in some Hallmark movie. Instead, I walked into a perfectly decorated living room where they were already exchanging gifts without me. They froze the moment I stepped in. Behind them, the Christmas tree glowed, scattering red and gold wrapping paper across the floor. Candace held a Sephora gift bag in her lap. Julia was laughing at something I wasn't part of. Helen sat on the couch with a glass of wine, not even bothering to look surprised. "Oh," Candace said with a thin smile. "You're home early." Helen didn't turn her head. "Just a few small gifts." "Nothing big," she said casually, sipping her wine. I stood there in my work clothes, my coat still wet with snow, watching them bask in each other's warmth while I stood in the cold. Not outside the house, but inside the family I was never truly part of. And Oliver? He was sitting right there with them, scrolling through his phone. He didn't even look up. I should have said something. I should have stormed out. But I just stood there like a statue, holding that little pastry box in my hand until the heat from it drained out, like all the hope I'd held onto for too long. That night, I cried in the shower. I cried quietly so Oliver wouldn't hear, And when he came in and saw my puffy eyes, he said, "Don't let it get to you, babe. They didn't mean to leave you out. I didn't mean to do that." The three words haunted me for months. If they didn't mean it, what message did they convey about me? Did they find me so unremarkable and inconsequential that they failed to notice my absence? But the worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the realization that Oliver had gotten used to it, that I had gotten used to it, that I was expected to accept crumbs and call it love. That Christmas wasn't the explosion. It was the quiet, cracking sound of a heart giving up. And even though I didn't know it at the time, it was the beginning of the end. I don't know what I expected when I walked into Helen's house that afternoon. Maybe I still held on to some foolish hope that this year would be different. That maybe, just maybe, someone would look at me like I belonged. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew. The house smelled like cinnamon and baked butter, the kind of scent that wraps around you like a memory. Fairy lights sparkled across the living room. The Christmas tree towered majestically, brimming with exquisite ornaments that appeared almost unreal. Candace's laugh rang out from the kitchen, high and full of joy. Julia stood by the fireplace, retelling a story that had Helen cackling into her wineglass. And then there was Oliver, my husband. He was pouring white wine into crystal glasses, like he'd done it 1,000 times before, like he belonged in this world where I never did. I stood behind him for almost a full minute, waiting for him to turn around, smile, and say something. He didn't even notice I was there. Dinner was served with all the elegance of a magazine spread. The table was long and draped in white lace, the plates gleaming under candlelight. Helen placed the turkey at the center, like it was some sacred family heirloom. She sat at the head of the table like royalty. Candace and Julia, already engrossed in their own world of inside jokes and shared memories, sat opposite me at the far end again. They talked about Napa Valley and art galleries. Helen kept toasting her daughters, throwing compliments like confetti. "My girls are so accomplished, so elegant, so capable." She never looked my way. And then she said it. "Some women just don't know how to make a proper pumpkin pie." It was a simple sentence. Casual, light-hearted even. But I knew. Everyone at that table knew. The words directly targeted me. I felt the words land like ice on my skin. I said nothing. I simply smiled and took another sip of wine. I told myself if I stayed quiet, if I didn't make a scene, maybe they'd go easy on me this time. I was wrong. When dessert came, Helen clapped her hands and stood up like she was about to announce a miracle. "Before we eat the pie," she said, "I have a little surprise." She reached under her chair and pulled out a deep red gift bag, then another, and another. With a smile, each person received a name tag. Candace received a leather handbag. Julia got a luxury spa voucher. Oliver unwrapped a bottle of rare whiskey, the very one he'd mentioned in passing months ago. I sat still, my wine glass firm in my hand, the stem biting into my fingers. One by one, the bags disappeared. The bags gradually vanished until none remained. There was none left for me. Helen blinked innocently. "Oh, Everly," she said with mock surprise. "Looks like I forgot you." And then she laughed. Candace joined in, Julia giggled, and Oliver, my husband, laughed too. The sound of it cracked something inside me. It wasn't because they had forgotten about me. They no longer cared whether I noticed them or not. They weren't even trying to pretend. I looked around the table, at faces that once felt powerful to me, untouchable, and suddenly they didn't. They looked small, fragile, hollow. I smiled then. It wasn't because I was comfortable, but because I knew something they didn't. I hadn't come empty-handed either. I sat there for a moment, letting their laughter echo through the room. It didn't sting the way it used to. Not anymore. It sounded distant, fake, like an old recording played one too many times. I looked at Helen, her eyes already drifting past me as if I were nothing but a shadow. I placed my wine glass down gently and looked her straight in the eye. "Good thing I didn't forget you," I said, my voice calm and clear. The room froze. The laughter stopped. Candace looked confused. Julia paused mid-sip. Even Oliver turned to me, blinking like I'd just spoken a different language. Helen raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh? What do you mean by that?" I didn't answer right away. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a small box wrapped in silver paper, tied with a red ribbon. The wrapping style gave the impression of holding something precious, and in a way, it did. For you, I said, placing it gently in front of her. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She reached for it with a cautious hand, trying to maintain her usual poise. Oh, Everly, you didn't have to. You know I never expect anything from you. I know, I replied softly. But this one is very special. Helen's hands faltered just a bit as she untied the ribbon. The room had gone silent, like the air itself was holding its breath. She peeled back the wrapping, her smile fading by the second. Inside was a thick stack of papers. At first, she didn't understand. She flipped through the first few pages, her eyes scanning the words. Then she stopped. Her fingers stiffened. Her breathing changed. For a brief moment, her mask cracked. Candace leaned over. What is it? Helen said nothing. Julia stood up, walking closer. Mom? I leaned back in my chair, poured myself another glass of wine, and said evenly, those are financial reports from your event planning business, along with some amended tax returns for the last 7 years. Helen's hand trembled. I noticed you underreported over $200,000 in income over the last 3 years alone. That's not even counting the company-funded personal trips and luxury purchases. Silence. Real, heavy, soul-shaking silence. Candace grabbed the papers from Helen's hands, flipping through them frantically. Her face went pale. Is this real? Julia grabbed a page, her voice barely audible. You hid this from us? Helen opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked at me, and for the first time in 6 years, 6 long years, I saw fear. I do not fear embarrassment. No, this was fear of truth. The fear stemmed from the potential for exposure. I am afraid of losing control. Oliver finally spoke, his voice low and sharp. Everly, are you serious? You are spying on my mom? I turned to him slowly. I wasn't spying. I was investigating. There's a difference. He blinked, stunned. I took a slow sip of wine. You see, Oliver, I have eyes, and I pay attention. Something you've never done. Helen slammed her hand on the table and stood up, voice trembling. You have no idea what you've just done. I smiled. Oh, I know exactly what I've done. Her daughter stared at her in stunned silence. Her son looked lost, and for once I was the one holding the room in the palm of my hand. They had pushed me out for years. They made fun of me behind my back. They dismissed me as weak, forgettable, and small. But this time, I didn't break. This time, I brought receipts. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The room that had once buzzed with laughter and wine now sat in a thick, suffocating silence. The only sound was the faint crinkling of paper as Candace turned page after page with trembling fingers. Her eyes scanned each line like she was searching for a way out, a loophole, a lie, anything that might make this less real. Mom, she said finally, voice tight. What is this? You told me you didn't have money when I needed to fix the house. You cried and said you were struggling. Helen opened her mouth, but again, no words came. Julia stepped closer, hands clenched. You told me you couldn't help when the baby was sick, and I couldn't pay for the hospital. I borrowed money from my ex-mom. I begged you. Helen turned to her daughters, her perfect mask now cracking at the corners. I didn't know how to tell you. I was trying to protect the business. I had to. No, I said softly, my voice cutting through the tension. You lied. You didn't protect anything. You just kept taking. I looked across the table at Oliver. He was staring at the documents in front of him like they were written in a language he couldn't understand. His hands clenched at his sides. Mom, is it true? Helen finally found her voice, but it was weak now, shaky. It's not what you think. I borrowed some money, yes, but I had a plan to return it. Candace slammed her hand on the table. You used Dad's 401k? This transaction originates from his retirement account. Helen's eyes widened in panic. I was going to put it back. I swear. I needed time. Julia's face twisted with pain. You lied to us. This happened repeatedly. You watched us struggle and kept all this hidden. Helen turned to Oliver, reaching for him like he could somehow still shield her. Sweetheart, please. But he pulled away. And then the front door opened. Richard, Helen's husband, the father none of us had seen all evening, stepped in with a half-empty cup of tea in his hand. He stopped mid-step, his eyes narrowing as he saw the scene before him. The tension, the tears, the open files. "What's going on?" Candace didn't hesitate. She grabbed the stack of papers and walked straight to him. "Dad, you need to read this." He took the document slowly, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. His face went pale. "Helen," he said, voice low and tight, "tell me this isn't real." "I did it for us," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. "For the company. To keep things going." "You stole from me," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "From the retirement I worked my whole life for." "I had to. There's no need to, Helen." "You lied. You hid money. You used me and everyone at this table." She tried to reach for him, but he stepped back. His hand clutched the table for balance. "I don't believe this." "Dad?" Julia rushed to his side. His breathing was shallow and erratic. His face was pale. Then it happened. Richard clutched his chest, eyes wide, and collapsed forward like a man whose heart had finally caught up with the weight of all the betrayal. "Call an ambulance!" I shouted, already reaching for my phone. Julia screamed. Candace caught his head as he fell. Oliver froze, stunned. "Helen?" She dropped to her knees, her hands shaking, tears spilling, but I wasn't sure if they were real or just part of her performance. The woman who once ruled this house like a queen was now watching her kingdom fall apart. This was not due to my actions. She held the belief that the truth would remain hidden. The sirens sounded, sending a shockwave through the icy house. Red and blue lights flickered against the windows, painting the elegant white walls in chaos. 2 EMTs rushed in with a stretcher, moving with a kind of urgency that left no room for questions. They barely glanced at Helen as she tried to direct them, brushing past her without hesitation. "Step back, ma'am," one of them said firmly. "We need space." Helen looked stunned, like she wasn't used to being dismissed. Julia clutched Richard's hand tightly as they lifted him onto the stretcher. Her eyes were wild with fear, her knuckles white from holding on. Candace walked beside them, silent and pale, trying to stay strong. I stood near the door, watching the whole scene unfold like I wasn't a part of it. I felt still, empty. Not numb but distant, like I'd stepped out of my own skin and was watching from somewhere else. Oliver stood in the middle of the room, completely frozen, like someone had unplugged him from reality. His wine glass had shattered on the floor. Forgotten. Helen dropped to her knees near the table. "Please," she sobbed, her voice high-pitched and trembling. "Please save him. He's my husband." "Please don't take him." But no one turned to her. No one held her hand. No one believed her tears anymore. She reached toward Richard as the EMTs rolled the stretcher past, but Julia stepped in between. "Don't touch him," she said coldly. Candace added, voice sharp. "You've done enough." The words hit Helen like a slap. She froze mid-reach, her hand dangling in the air, shaking. For years, she held this family together with guilt and control, demanding loyalty, obedience, and silence. But now, in the moment she needed someone to stand beside her, there was no one left. She had spent years turning everyone into puppets, but she never noticed the strings were fraying. We all followed the ambulance out to the driveway. The snow had started to fall again, soft, slow, quiet. The snow had a muffled quality, making it seem as though even the sky was suppressing its sound. Candace climbed into the back of the ambulance. Julia turned to me. "Can you drive us to the hospital?" I nodded. "Of course." Helen stood there, looking around like a ghost. "I'll come too." Julia didn't even look at her. "No one's stopping you," she said flatly. "But don't pretend anymore." "We've seen everything." Helen said nothing. She just followed the lights down the driveway, her steps uneven, her shoulders hunched. I looked at Oliver, standing on the porch like a lost boy. He opened his mouth to speak, but I turned away before he could. The moment he laughed at me, he destroyed everything that remained between us. As the ambulance disappeared down the street, I looked up at the dark sky. Thick clouds had hidden the stars. The house behind us, once full of laughter and glowing lights, now looked like a stage after the curtain had fallen. That Christmas, there were no carols, no joy, just silence. And the crumbling ruins of a lie too big to hold up any longer. The hospital waiting room was quiet in that eerie, unnatural way, like grief and guilt had pressed all the sound out of the air. Candace and Julia sat close together, eyes blank, not speaking. I stood near the reception desk, my phone in hand, staring at the dark screen even though I had no messages. I didn't want to move. I was unable to think clearly. It felt like the whole world had collapsed, but not on me. However, that was not the case this time. Mike sat a few chairs away, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight. He kept looking at the floor like it held answers he couldn't find. Almost an hour passed in silence. Then he stood, walked over. His voice was low, strained. "Are you satisfied now?" I blinked. "What? This is what you wanted, right? You planned it. You exposed my mom, humiliated her in front of everyone, and now my dad's in a hospital bed." I stared at him, feeling the old ache rising, but it didn't hurt the same anymore. "You think I wanted this? You brought it all out on Christmas Day," he said. "You chose that moment." I let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Is this a better moment? What do you think I've been doing for 6 years, Mike? Waiting. I am swallowing my pride. I have repeatedly given your mother the opportunity to treat me with dignity and respect. And you? You stood by and let her tear me down piece by piece." He looked away. "However, my work was far from over. I used to think you were stuck in the middle. I convinced myself that you were merely attempting to maintain harmony. But now I see the truth. You never stood up for me because you didn't want to. I didn't know it was this bad," he muttered. "That's because you never looked. And when I finally stood up for myself, you didn't thank me. You blamed me." Candace's voice cut through the space between us. Cold, firm. "She didn't destroy this family, Mike. Mom did." Julia added. Everly just pulled back the curtain. The mess was already there. Mike had no response. His hands were shaking now, his face pale. I looked at him not with anger, but with a strange emptiness. I felt a kind of quiet, irreversible understanding. "You had so many chances," I said softly. "I didn't need you to fight every battle for me. I just needed to know you saw me, that you'd choose me when it counted." I reached into my pocket and took off my wedding ring. "This is the last time I wait for you to choose me." I placed it in his hand. He clenched his fingers around it like letting go would destroy something, but the object had already vanished. When the doctor came out and said Richard was out of critical condition, I knew it was time. I walked out of that hospital without looking back. The night I got home from the hospital, I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the middle of our living room, staring at the photos still hanging on the walls. The photos were from our wedding day. The journey to Oregon was an unforgettable experience. Perched on the antique leather chair, Mike read the Sunday newspaper, seemingly unaffected by anything. But that life wasn't mine anymore. I opened the jewelry box, dropped my wedding ring inside, and pulled out a small suitcase. Just a few clothes. My laptop, wallet, passport. I didn't need much, just space. Just air. It's simply a means of escape. The next morning, I emailed the lawyer I had quietly contacted weeks ago before I ever wrapped Helen's gift. Subject line, begin divorce proceedings. That afternoon, Mike sent his first message since the hospital. "Everly, please. I need to talk." I didn't reply. 2 weeks later, Helen was formally charged with tax fraud and financial crimes. The documents I'd given to my lawyer had made their way to the IRS and the press. Her name hit the local papers like a rock dropped into still water, ripples everywhere. A photo of her leaving court gray suit. No makeup, hair messy, eyes hollow went viral in town. And I didn't feel triumphant, just right. The day after Richard's discharge, Candace texted to inform her that he had filed for divorce. Julia cut off contact completely. Helen tried calling, messaging. She even wrote handwritten letters. No one answered. She lost everything. But I didn't rejoice. Real victory doesn't occur when someone else falls. It's when they no longer have power over you. Mike kept writing emails, voicemails, apologies that swung between desperate and angry. One said, "You planned to leave me from the start, didn't you?" I didn't bother replying. If he still thought I was the problem, there was nothing left to save. Weeks passed. One day, he showed up outside my new apartment. He looked thinner, worn out. His voice was tired. Just 5 minutes, he said. Please. I stepped outside, arms crossed. I didn't invite him in. He stared at me like he barely recognized the woman in front of him. I should have stood by you, he said. I nodded. Yes, you should have. I want to fix this. I shook my head gently. You don't need to. I'm not waiting anymore, Mike. I've already chosen, and then I closed the door. Quietly, no slamming. There are no concluding remarks to make. Just closure. Inside, I sat on the sofa and let the golden afternoon sunlight stretch across the floorboards of my small studio. It was quiet, clean, mine. Every Friday, I bought fresh flowers. Every Sunday, I read. Every month, I revised my personal budget, my savings, and my goals. I was rebuilding. This is not for anyone else, just for me. When Helen was officially sentenced, I didn't celebrate. I folded the newspaper and tossed it in the bin. Her fall no longer defined my freedom. Freedom was mine long before that. Candace and Julia still kept in touch. They apologized. They thanked me. One message from Julia read, "If it weren't for you, we'd still be living in denial. I'm sorry we let you suffer so long." I didn't reply, but I smiled. I didn't need recognition. I had already reclaimed something far greater, myself. One rainy Saturday, I sat at a small bookstore cafe, sipping coffee and reading a novel. I never had time for When I Was Mike's Wife. A woman next to me smiled. That's a fantastic one. You'll love the ending. I smiled back. I already had one. She didn't ask more, and I didn't need to explain. As I stepped out into the drizzle, the streets were slick and quiet. I felt something I hadn't felt in years, warmth. It's not a man's fault. I don't come from a family. However, it comes from a peaceful place. For the first time in my life, freedom wasn't a fantasy or a word whispered in the dark. It was real. It was now. I once believed that receiving love was the source of happiness. Now I understand. Happiness is choosing to love yourself, and I will never go back to the woman I was in that house. I will never do this again.